Welcome to this week's video. This week's video is on life in England during the reign of King James I and King Charles I. I hope you enjoyed watching my earlier video, and if you like the content that I make, please do make sure that you subscribe to Offbeat Gyan. So let's jump into the topic. Let's talk about England during the period of King James I first, and then we'll talk about England during the period of King Charles I. Okay, so Elizabeth I, she was the last of the Tudor dynasty and she was the last of the Tudor monarchs. And she had started ruling over England in the year 1558. And she ruled from 1558 to March 1603. That is from 1558 to 1603. And by this time she was around 69 years old. In some places it is mentioned that she was 67 years old. Anyway, she was in her late 60s, and until then she had maintained this image of being absolutely healthy, youthful, and in control of England. And England was definitely enjoying a period of prosperity, growth, and the British Empire was gradually being founded during this period. So sometime in 1603, in the earlier months of 1603, she developed sickness and she fell ill, and she died in March 1603. So during this period, she had never actually made a declaration as to who would succeed her upon her death, because she did not want to create a situation of chaos and confusion in England, because there would definitely be a struggle between the ambitious successors as to who would get to rule over England upon the death of its reigning monarch, that is Queen Elizabeth I. So she never left a will or made a declaration about her successor. But then the proceedings to ensure a smooth transition had already begun. And this was set in motion by her Secretary of State, Robert Cecil, who knew that England could very quickly plunge into chaos and confusion if there wasn't a smooth transition of power. So he had already started negotiations with Elizabeth's closest male relative, that is James VI of Scotland. James VI was the son of Elizabeth I's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots had been executed earlier by Elizabeth because she had been a Catholic and she aspired to be the ruler of England. Elizabeth had tolerated her for quite a while, but then she had started hatching a lot of plots, murder attempts against Elizabeth, and Elizabeth decided to execute her. So, James I of England was actually James VI of Scotland. He was the King of Scotland. That means before he became the King of England, he was already the King of Scotland. And he was James VI of Scotland. So Robert Cecil, Elizabeth I's Secretary of State, had already started negotiations with James I to become the new King of England upon the death of Elizabeth I. So the process was very smoothly managed, and when Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudor monarchs, died, then King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, Scotland and Ireland. Elizabeth was the Queen of England and Ireland. James VI of Scotland took up the title of King James I of England, Scotland and Ireland. And this was a very smooth process. There was no confusion, there was no chaos, there was no struggle for power. And the regime also, the rule also continued with the same practices that were adopted during Elizabeth's time. So it ensured a period of wealth, peace and prosperity. And he was the first king to rule over all three regions. So James VI of Scotland became James I of England, Scotland and Ireland, and he became the first king of the United Kingdom. Now, going on to talk about life in 17th century England. That is, life in England during the period of King James I. How was it? What was happening in England and overseas? Okay, because this is the period when European colonies were gradually expanding overseas, and England also had joined the race for colonizing different parts of the world. Europeans had started traveling across the world. The Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese. They traveled to South America and North America. I've got two maps here which will help you to understand. In one map which actually displays the eastern seaboard of the United States, you have something highlighted as French territory, and the parts in color, they are the English territories in North America. So Englishmen, they established new colonies in Virginia and New England in America, and in Barbados and in India. So the next slide will give you an idea about Barbados, a very tiny island. So the West Indian island of Barbados was also an English acquisition. It became an English colony. So English colonies in North America. The next slide will talk about the English colonies in North America, and then we'll talk about the English colonization of India. But first, English colonies in North America, or the colonization of North America. So during the period of King James I, the navy, the naval strength of England was reduced. As you all know, the founder of the English Navy was Henry VIII. And Elizabeth, his daughter, had strengthened the English Navy. But James I, as soon as he came to power, he reduced the naval strength. But his son, Charles I, who took over in 1625, made it strong once again. So English colonial expansion in the American mainland increased during the period of James I and his son Charles I. So it was during this period that the strong foundation of the British Empire and that of the United States of America was laid. There were two companies in England which actually encouraged this emigration and colonial expansion and settlement of colonies in America. The two companies were Virginia Company and Massachusetts Bay Company. Both were based in London. They were not based in America. They were based in London. And these two companies were private companies whose members were rich English merchants. They were members of the English upper class. They were members who belonged to the nobility. They were members who had trading interests. They were the rich people. Okay. Their purpose was they wanted to establish markets, foreign markets for English goods. So they wanted to establish English colonies in America so that there would be an overseas market for goods which were made in England. Plus they were also looking for new resources which could be brought to England from the colonies in America. So these raw materials could be supplied to the factories and manufacturing industries in England. And these companies, they had the money, they had the huge infrastructure, financial infrastructure to support the emigration of people with their families from England to America. A lot of money is required to transport people from a country which is on one side of the Atlantic Ocean across the Atlantic Ocean to the other side. These people, they would be traveling for a long period of time. So sturdy ships were required. The manpower was required to man the ships to continue with the journey. And for such a long, unpredictable and difficult journey, food, water, provisions, everything was required. So it was not an enterprise which could be done lightheartedly. It demanded a lot of money. It demanded a lot of courage. Not just the traveling part, all the work behind the scenes. And such money could only be provided by the upper class members of English society, by the aristocracy and by the rich merchants. So they provided money to buy ships, equipment and pay the wages of the sailors who would undertake the very risky, unpredictable journey to transport the emigrants to America. Now, why did people want to emigrate from England to America? There were multiple reasons. Some of the reasons were economic reasons, some of the reasons were religious. There were also political and commercial reasons for people wanting to leave England and go to America and set up colonies and settlements over there. And the sponsors, the people who provided the money for the emigration, belonged to the upper class, belonged to the nobility, the royalty, even the royalty. But the people who actually emigrated, the people who actually traveled in these ships with their families, who took the risk of crossing the Atlantic Ocean and arriving in a new, hostile, inhospitable terrain, unfamiliar terrain, where people who belong to the lower and the middle classes. So, Virginia in America had already been discovered by Sir Walter Raleigh, and the colonization was not happening at that point of time. It was not successful. But the colonization happened during the period of James the First. So Virginia provided a lot of tobacco which was traded across English colonies, and tobacco trade was extremely lucrative. So you can see in the slide you have this picture of Walter Raleigh, who was later on executed at the request of Spain during the reign of James the First. He was a very popular courtier, a dashing, swashbuckling adventurer during the period of Elizabeth the First. He was in fact one of her favorites, and he had discovered Virginia, but he could not successfully settle or make a colony out there, and Spain demanded that Walter Raleigh should be executed, and the execution of Walter Raleigh happened during the period of James the First. The other painting shows you the arrival of Raleigh in Virginia, and you can see the natives bowing down and welcoming him, unaware of the plight that awaited them. Okay, now my next slide talks about Pilgrim Fathers. Who were the Pilgrim Fathers? The Pilgrim Fathers were a group of English Puritans who were unwilling to practice Anglicanism and live in England. If you wanted to live in England, you had to be an Anglican. So the Puritans were very, very adamant that they did not want to practice Anglicanism. They wanted religious freedom. So they set sail across the Atlantic Ocean in a ship called Mayflower from Plymouth, and they arrived in North America in 1620. And so when they arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, they decided to name the place where they settled down as Plymouth. So this group or this band of brave travelers, adventurers who were looking for religious freedom and who emigrated to America and arrived in America in 1620, they are known as the Pilgrim Fathers. Okay, so this part of America, which was colonized by the English, it came to be known as New England. And you can see that in the earlier map that I had put in an earlier slide. I think it was slide number 5. You'll find it in slide number 5. So those places highlighted in pink, yellow and green, they are the English colonies. Now coming back to Puritanism in New England. So this emigration of people was not happening just from England. People from all over Europe were leaving Europe and traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and arriving in America. But our focus is of course on the English colonies because we are studying about English social history. The Puritans did not have a very good time in England. They did not enjoy religious freedom. So that was one reason why they were willing to leave England, cross the Atlantic, take such a huge risk and arrive in this new place which was completely different and new for them. It was a hostile territory. Okay. So two Puritan groups were there in New England. One set up a colony in Massachusetts, and this group, they followed the Geneva Code of Puritanism. Now, this Geneva Code of Puritanism followed the precepts and the principles of John Calvin. John Calvin had laid out the principles of the Geneva brand of Puritanism in the 16th century. So they wanted to set up a religious state with strong Puritan principles. So the northern group of colonies in the United States had a very strong Puritan character, which actually set the foundation of the kind of country that America would become in later years. And this influenced their prosperity, their growth also. Another colony was established in Rhode Island by the Puritan rebel Roger Williams. He believed in religious freedom. Virginia was Anglican in nature and Maryland was Roman Catholic, and it was founded by Lord Baltimore. Next, I'll be talking about the African slave trade, a very lucrative and extremely inhuman and exploitative business. So, John Hawkins was the first English slave trader. You can see his painting on the slide. He sailed to Sierra Leone in Africa and he took 300 African slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to the cotton and sugar plantations in South and North America. So he was the first Englishman to initiate the inhuman African slave trade. He sold these human beings, and what he got in return were pearls, animal hides and sugar, which he brought back to England. And he had the full support of Queen Elizabeth I. If you remember, Queen Elizabeth I had actually given him charge of managing the English shipbuilding and shipping sector. So it was a very profitable but cruel trade that was supported by Elizabeth, and these slaves were supplied to the English colonies of Virginia and some of the West Indian islands which were under English control. So who promoted emigration, and how did they promote emigration? How did they inspire people, encourage people to take up this very difficult journey of traveling across an unpredictable vast ocean and arrive in a land which could be hostile, which could be inhospitable? The attraction, how they were lured was by the promise of free land. Okay. English colonies in the United States of America have a lot of land available. So that was one of the attractive sort of hooks which attracted people to go to America. In England, by law, the property was usually inherited by the eldest son. So the younger sons did not actually have any property. They did not have land or anything to hold on to. So going to America was a better option for them, because there they could go, they could get land and they could work and build their own families over there. And some were compelled to take land on rent or lease, and the rents were increasing in England. So there was very stiff competition among tenants for the available land. So these companies which sponsored emigration, they used to bring out these pamphlets in the beginning, attracting people to travel to America because there a lot of land was available. And that is why many people decided to emigrate to America. And skilled craftsmen, they were also looking forward to traveling to the new colonies because their craft and skill was in great demand in this new territory. So people from all classes traveled to America in search of better prospects. And the English government, what it did was, when the prisons became overcrowded, they usually sent the convicts, the prisoners captured during the Civil War, to these far-flung colonies as a form of punishment. Sometimes these young men were forcibly taken to the colonies by private companies to work for them. So they could buy their freedom eventually. They would have to work for a particular period of time, and then the owner would decide that, okay, you pay me this much amount of money, I will give you your freedom. But even that option was not available to the African slaves. They were kept under permanent bondage. Soon what happened? Voluntary immigration to the colonies in the USA stopped, and gradually the English colonies in the USA, they developed their own unique identity and way of life free from English influence. They retained their neutrality and they no longer considered themselves as subjects of the English monarchy. And they established their own rules, codes of governance and behavior in a land 3,000 miles away from English soil. But the legal system, the administrative system, the system of self-governance did mimic the English system, because the English system promoted a lot of self-governance. And that is the system that was eventually copied and used along with a number of innovations by the Americans in the English colonies in the United States of America. So with that, I come to the conclusion of this particular video on life in England during the rule of James I. I've called it Life in England during the rule of James I and Charles I. In the next video, I will be talking about life in England during the period of Charles I, and then on the Civil War also. So I hope you will understand whatever I have been blabbering about, and it will help you in deciphering this very difficult book, Trevelyan's English Social History. It's not actually difficult, it's quite simple if you are interested in history. Otherwise, it can be a taxing read. So with that, I will leave you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.